Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Mary Miller, Director of the Getty Research Institute, or the GRI. If you're joining us via live stream in a time zone different from Southern California, welcome, and a hearty welcome to those of you who come to us on a day other than October 28th, 2022. We acknowledge our presence today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. We're here today to dive into and to go beyond the exhibition, Reinventing the Americas, Construct, Erase, Repeat, which analyzes representations of the Americas produced between the 16th and 19th centuries, questioning the mythologies and the utopian visions that proliferated after the arrival of Europeans to the continents. The Getty Research Institute, and maybe all of you, today feel connected to New Spain, of which this place, California, was long a part, as well as the quarter century when it was part of the Republic of Mexico, yielding a history that took place here in California, indigenous and Spanish. The makers of the works in this exhibition mixed reality based on their own expectations. What are yours? Chroniclers, illustrators, and printmakers created portable and reproducible images that circulated around the world, fueling the spread of stereotypes and prejudices, and supporting a greedy, covetous impression to perform upon the Americas. To counter these European views, which are rampant in our GRI collections, the exhibition features artistic interventions by Denilson Baniwa, a contemporary Brazilian indigenous artist from the Amazon region of Brazil, and we'll be hearing from him later. I first saw his work in 2020 in Sao Paulo, days before the world shut down for the pandemic. The exhibition also includes the voices of local community groups in Los Angeles, and I hope you will look for their words and their commentaries in the exhibition labels. So I hope you will spend time in the exhibition, which is nearby on the main floor of the GRI. I also want to encourage you to visit the exhibition in the Getty Museum, the Códice Maya de México, the oldest book of the Americas. Authenticated by the National Institute of Anthropology in Mexico. The Codex last visited the United States in 1971 when it was roundly denounced as a fake, but it's real, as Mexico showed in 2018. And I'll be leading a tour at 1:45, halfway through your lunch break. So if you would like to come, take the second half of your lunch break with me. Where should you meet me? At the entry to the exhibition. It has its own little fountain area. So housekeeping about today's symposium. To make today's presentations accessible, the program will be offered in English and Spanish, and with some presentations delivered in Portuguese. All of the morning session will be read in English or delivered in English. I don't know if you're all reading, but if you would like to listen in Spanish and are sitting here in the auditorium, please walk back to where you just came in and pick up a headset, which are labeled according to language. This afternoon, we're going to hear sessions in Portuguese, so you may want to pick up a headset if you would prefer to listen in English. For those of you listening on Zoom, you may also select your language by enabling the interpretation feature, and I bet this is being projected to you on Zoom right now with a textual description of what you do. You want to click that little globe icon on the bottom of your screen. It appears in different places, depending on whether you're on a Mac, an iPad, or some other kind of delivery of the Zoom, and select your preferred language. You may also select the words that say mute original audio feature to avoid hearing two languages at once. And once again, welcome to the multiple reinventions of the Americas in context. You'll now hear from Idurre Alonso, the curator of the exhibition and the organizer of this symposium.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I'm Idurre Alonso, curator of the Latin American collections at the Getty Research Institute, and also a curator of Reinventing the Americas. I want to thank the people that are joining us today, from the people around the world watching us online to the people that are here with us in this auditorium. As you know, the symposium has been organized in conjunction with the exhibition Reinventing the Americas, on view right now at the Getty Research Institute. And for those that haven't seen the exhibition yet, let me give you a short sentence about the show. It's based on our collection and is built around the premise that America is a European invention. Mary already told you about it. So now let me say that it's a pleasure and an honor to have such a remarkable group of international scholars and an artist participating in this symposium. I would like to thank them for accepting the invitation to be part of this event. I also want you to know that they contributed to Reinventing the Americas exhibition as I was planning it. Some were part of a workshop I organized 3 years ago when I was still shaping the project. We spent 2 days looking at the incredible materials in the GRI collections, thinking about the possible narratives in the show. Several of their ideas and suggestions ended up being part of the exhibition. From the group of presenters, I want to especially thank Renato Meneses, who worked with me for a year in the exhibition. We were in the middle of the pandemic, and that allowed us to have very long conversations via Zoom. He was in Paris, I was in Los Angeles, on how to tell this very complex story. I also want to take a minute to acknowledge the work of Thisbe Gensler, who has made all the logistical arrangements for this event. Reinventing the Americas begins with an audio recording of an excerpt of the letter by Christopher Columbus, written on his return from his first trip to the Americas in 1493. Columbus talks about the continent as a marvelous and indescribable place with rivers filled with gold. This text starts the narrative of the exhibition as the first European invention of the Americas. To add some local perspectives to the show, I invited several members of our community to write various labels in the exhibition. I just want to highlight the label that opens the exhibition together with Columbus's excerpt, written by Salvador Álvarez, Arturo Cuevas, Federico Mora, and Efraín Pérez from Getty grounds. Most history is not reality, as it consists of both truth and imagination. That is how history is written, with a splash of truth and many lies, which in this case were fabricated to attract Europeans to America. Today, we're going to listen to presentations that will discuss the historical context of these images on the Americas, why and how these pieces were created, how truthful they were, what were the political implications that affected their production, how they were perceived and understood. The exhibition ends with a mural created by the Nilson Baniwa, in which he narrates the beginning of the world from the Baniwa perspective. The opening and the end of the show highlights the fact that the reinvention of the Americas has never been a static, homogeneous, and a linear process. It also confirms that we keep reinventing the Americas today. I hope that this symposium helps us understand the way in which the many reinventions of the Americas have shaped the view we have on our continent. And now, let me introduce you to the first speaker, Nicolás Biakowski, who is a specialist in early modern cultural history. He works as a professor and researcher at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. His publications include Bárbara y Guerrera, La historia de Tomiris, Reina de los Masajetas, from 2021, Fuimos muy peores en vicios, from 2020, and Historia Natural y Mítica de los Elefantes from 2019, co-author with José Burucua.
Hi, good morning. I am very happy to be here today. I would like to begin by thanking the GRI for the invitation to participate in the symposium, in particular Thisbe Gensler for making all things practical regarding my arrival here possible. And I would also like to thank Idurre for the invitation and to congratulate her for the exhibition, and also to thank her for allowing me to witness the blossoming of the exhibition from the workshop we shared here a few years ago until the opening now. The representation of America by Europeans has been full of confusion, contradiction, and debate even before the continent had that name. After arriving to America, Christopher Columbus's first reaction was to describe its inhabitants as barbarians or savages. The distinction between barbarians and savages was not as clear-cut then as it would become after the Enlightenment. On October the 12th, 1492, Columbus wrote in his diary that the people that he met in America were, and I quote, very poor people. They went about all naked, like their mothers had brought them to this world. And although they are very well formed, with beautiful bodies and good faces, they don't know armor nor iron, and they have no sect whatsoever. Furthermore, since he could not understand their language, he concluded that it was a European's duty to teach them how to speak. Pope Alexander VI understood immediately the meaning of Columbus's explorations. On May the 4th, 1493, he signed the Bull Inter Caetera, where he stated that it was a papal will that, I quote, the barbaric nations that inhabit the new-found lands shall be depressed and reduced to the same Catholic faith and Christian religion, end quote. Given this framework, the first images of America are really not that surprising. Perhaps this German engraving from 1505 could be described as an idealized and rather inaccurate family portrait. It depicts the Americans as heroic savages or cannibals, thus revealing some of the European complex and contrasting attitudes towards the people they encountered. The men on the right appear admirable and heroic as they pose proudly by their weapons, while the women and children on their left form a loving family scene. In the center of the image, however, a human head, leg, and arm rose over a fire. On the far left, a woman bites into an arm. Cannibalism, real or imagined, was from the start one of the aspects of American society that Europeans found most shocking. The caption, based on Amerigo Vespucci's description of the people he encountered in Brazil, presents a mixture of repulsion and attraction to this strange new society. I quote, "The people are thus naked, handsome, brown, well-shaped in body. Their heads, necks, arms, private parts, feet of men and women are little covered with feathers. The men also have many precious stones in their faces and breasts. No one also has anything, but all things are in common. And the men have as wives those who please them, be they mothers, sisters, or friends. Therein they make no distinction. They also fight with each other. They also eat each other, even those who are slain. They become 150 years old and have no government," end quote. The violence entailed by the conquest and colonization of the continent was also debated from the very beginning, be it in the guise of justification or condemnation. In 1550 and 1551, summoned by Emperor Charles I, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda and Bartolomé de las Casas discussed the issue in Valladolid. Sepúlveda justified violence and war against the American peoples on 4 grounds. They were barbarians, they committed crimes against natural law, they had oppressed and murdered innocent people, and they were infidels who had to be instructed into Catholic faith. Las Casas, on the contrary, defended a unifying idea of humanity. Americans were not essentially different or inferior to the Europeans. They were thus capable of receiving the Christian religion peacefully. Spain's role in the New World should be spiritual and not political nor economic. He did not bother to ask the Indians, as he called them, whether or not they wanted to convert into Christianity, but he stated that they lived in harmonic communities governed by strict laws, that they possessed a beautiful language, and that idolaters and cannibals were a minority among them who could be persuaded to receive the gospel. For Las Casas, they were barbarians as well, but the meaning of the word was different. It was much closer to what we would call otherness. He also thought that the Americans were no worse than the Spanish. I quote, "We ourselves, in our ancestors, have been much worse, be it in irrational and confused polity, as in vices and brutal customs, all around this, our Spain." Both issues, the image of Americans in European eyes and the violence of conquest and colonization, have been chronicled and reflected upon almost endlessly. Although all of this is well known, I would like to go through some texts and images that represent the people of the Americas and the violence perpetrated throughout the continent. I will try to briefly examine their origins and motivations, to approach their role in several political debates of their day, and perhaps to have a look at their posthumous life in our own days and in this exhibition in particular. So let's begin. Attempts to represent the people in the Americas were abundant, took several shapes and forms, and had different and even contradictory objectives. It would be surprising to discover the opposite if we consider the diversity of experience and relations in the long period from the arrival of the Europeans to America in 1492 and until the beginning of the struggles for independence. An unsurprising reaction by Europeans to the contact with the Americans was an attempt to integrate them to what they already knew or imagined. This idea could be modulated either in secular or religious terms. The peoples of the Americas were likened to barbarians or savages. As we know very well, the engravings produced by Theodore de Brie as an illustration for the first volume of America were among the most popular portraits of Native Americans in early modern times. They were devised for an edition of Thomas Harriot's A Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia, published in Frankfurt in 1590. While de Brie was exiled in London, he had managed to obtain Harriot's text and a set of watercolors painted by John White during the first settlement of Virginia. De Brie based the engravings of his edition of Harriot's work on a set of images produced by Lemoine de Morges and de Brie. From this very beginning, de Brie's Grand Voyage attempted to provide an account of the reality of the New World in terms of cultural and anthropological otherness. The ethnographic approach in de Brie's engravings was also comparative. The portraits of American men and women were joined by 5 images that attempted to show how the inhabitants of Great Britain had been, in times past, as savages of those of Virginia. Those are his words. This conviction would last a long time in the minds of the English settlers in America, and in any case, de Brie's engravings clearly display the Picts' headhunting habits, their nakedness, their primitivism, highlighting their similarities with the Americans as Europeans perceived them at the time. This was not always unnecessarily negative. Some of the characteristics of the Picts and of the Americans, such as their courage, their dignity, were considered valuable, particularly when compared to present decadent manners. This attitude can also be traced to classical antiquity. Thucydides had also transformed the perception of otherness into a temporal development. He thought that the Greek had in their past shared a coarse barbarian customs with barbarians of his time. But there were also several attempts to make the new word fit into biblical narrative. In this Adoration of the Kings, painted between 1501 and 1506, a Portuguese painter, Vasco Fernandes, combined traditional iconography with innovation. The wise men who, according to Matthew, traveled from the east to pay tribute to the new king of Judea in Bethlehem, had been depicted, at least from the 12th century, as representatives of every part of the world. The old man came from Asia, a younger man came from Europe, the youngest from Africa. In this case, Vasco Fernandes replaces the African man with an American, perhaps from the coast of Brazil, who has also come to celebrate the birth of the baby Jesus. Decades later, again, Theodore de Brie opened his edition of Harriot's Brief and True Report with an engraving depicting Adam and Eve's disobedience in paradise, which you can see here on the left. His notice to the reader compared the North American savages with mankind after the fall. deprived of God's gifts but not unable to provide for themselves. They have, I quote, no true knowledge of God, yet they pass us in many things, as in sober feeding and dexterity of wit in making things so neat and so fine, end quote. But we can also find good examples of this attitude in works of science, some of which are included in this exhibition. The frontispiece of Wilhelm Piso's Historia Naturalis Brasiliae, published in 1648, clearly presents the abundance of American nature as a Garden of Eden, and the Brazilian man and woman flanking the entrance to such a land of plenty could easily be interpreted as the indigenous equivalents of Adam and Eve. Thirdly, allegorical images representing both America and American nature integrated the lands previously known to the Europeans into the vision of the Old World. Let's take as an example the map of the world designed by Petrus Plancius and printed by Cornelis Claes in 1594, which you can also see in the exhibition. When faced with the task of representing Magallanica, Plancius and Claes depicted her white and dressed like Asia and Europa, and not nude and colored as in the case of Peruana, Mexicana, and Africana. Not only that, but she is shown riding an elephant, as you can see right here. And I dare all of you to go and find me an elephant in Tierra del Fuego. So, how can we explain this? Perhaps because Magallanica was imagined as a part of Terra Australis Incognita, an imaginary continent encompassing the entire southern half of the southern hemisphere. And the Dutch supposed that what they could find in India and the islands of the Indian Ocean could also be found in the southernmost parts of America. There are other possible explanations for this. Maybe we can discuss them later. In a similar manner, Europeans expected to find in America legendary and monstrous beings, hybrids of humans and other creatures that were said to exist beyond the margins of the known world. This tradition dates back to Pliny and his natural history, and in this exhibition you can see this image here, where you can see this image here, which is a 1543 copy of Zaccaria Alcasuini's Book of Wonders, originally written in the 13th century. Here we can see a blenny, which is a being with the face on his chest, an exponent of a people that had that anatomical feature. And on November of 1492, Columbus wrote that the Americans had told him that in the next island he would be able to find the cynocephaly, which you can see here, people with the heads of dogs. That tradition of imagining that you could find those beings in America persisted for a long time. A century later, during his trip to Guyana, Walter Raleigh was still looking for the blennies as the frontispiece of an edition of his trip shows here on the right. Perhaps more interestingly, other Europeans thought that American peoples had characteristics and customs of their own, different from those of Europe, which could hardly be considered better in themselves. Of course, the locus classicus for this attitude is Montaigne's essay on cannibals, first published in 1580, where he thus refers to the people of the New World. I quote, "I find that there is nothing barbarous and savage in this nation by anything that I can gather, excepting that everyone gives the title of barbarism to anything that is not in use in their own country." We find a similar disposition in Guillaume Thomas François Raynal's History of the Two Indies, published in the 1770s. This work has been subject to criticism from the moment of its appearance. The Spanish considered that it was too harsh on their endeavors. The Americans objected that it gave credit to the idea of the inferiority of America. The critics of the Enlightenment saw in it another example of Eurocentrism. Some of these accusations are undeniably true. The work is an attempt to understand the relationship of the European empires to the entire world. It is a Eurocentric history, but one that denounces European corruption, violence, and greed. Raynal and the other contributors to his work, Diderot among them, were convinced that it was not the vanquished, but, I quote, the English, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese who have behaved with a common frenzy beyond the equator. The entire European history is re-evaluated in the light of its global expansion, during which Europeans destroyed anyone in their path and ruined themselves morally. Right now's history rejects the idea that the non-European peoples can be considered savages, in the sense of lacking artificiality. Diderot thought that arts, beliefs, and human institutions are different in each society, and most of all, that they cannot be easily compared. Nomads, savages, other societies form communities that are as artificial as those in Europe, although artificial in different ways. His anti-imperialism was not just a denunciation of European abuse, it challenged the right of the Europeans to subject the rest of the world to their empire. Let's skip now to the representation of violence in America, which was also an important feature of texts and images regarding the experience of the continent from the very beginning. We have already seen some examples of this regarding the Americans and their cannibalism, real or imagined, and we know for a fact that this excited European imagination and incited fear, attraction, and will to power at the same time, no matter how contradictory they may seem. However, this is not the sort of representation of violence that I would like to analyze today. Instead, I intend to discuss texts and images regarding the violence of the conquest and colonization of the Americas that are truly, really terrible, so you've been warned. In many occasions, the representation of racial violence in America and radical violence in America became a signifier for European political and religious dissension. The formidable disposition of Christians to harm each other caused Catholic and Protestants mutual accusations of brutality. One of the items in this exhibition was published in Antwerp in 1587, and it is Richard Versteegen's Theater of the Cruelty of the Heretics of Our Time, which you can see, one of the pages of which you can see here on the left. Most of the atrocities attributed by Versteegen to Protestants in England, Belgium, and France represent the Catholic victims as martyrs of the and the Protestant perpetrators as heathens or barbarians. Among the horrible cruelties of the Huguenots in France, 2 soldiers, here in the image, take a hold of a victim's bowels, while 3 others bury a priest and 2 more cut children in half. Finally, the remaining soldiers castrate a priest, roast his organs, and force-feed him to him, later on disemboweling the old man and forcing him to, I quote, see how they are digested before his days end, end quote. Both the grill and the obsessive detail in the representation are similar to several depictions of the barbarian cannibalism of the New World. The image you can see on the right comes from an edition of Las Casas, brevísima descripción de la destrucción de las Indias, written in 1552. Cannibalism, in this case, is said to have been imposed upon the Americans by the harsh conditions created by their conquerors. A few years later, the Dutch embraced the history of the destruction of the West Indies as an analogy of their own clashes with the Spanish. In 1620, Jan Everhard Kloppenburg edited 2 volumes, the frontispieces of which you can see here. The first one, on the left, was entitled The Mirror of the Cruel and Horrible Spanish Tyranny Perpetrated in the Low Countries, and narrated the abuses committed by the troops of the Duke of Alba during the rebellion of the Low Countries. The second one, which you can see on the right, was a translation of Las Casas' Brevísima, published with a title that explicitly equated the sufferings of the Americans to that of the Dutch, The Mirror of the Spanish Tyranny Perpetrated on the West Indies. Evidently, the Dutch felt that the torments they had experienced were similar to those of the New World. In both cases, the weight of barbarism was put on Spanish domination. Both the Americans and the Dutch were victims of the Catholics' exploits. In other cases, violence against the Americans, or against either side of the religious divide in Europe, was represented to highlight the innocence of the victims and not only the savagery of the perpetrators. This is clearly the case in Las Casas Brevissima. In 1598, 4 decades after it was written, Theodore de Bry published in Frankfurt an illustrated edition of the work, which was openly anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish. The 17 engravings included in the book became the definitive visual document of Spanish cruelty in America and were crucial for the reception of Las Casas' indictment of his countrymen's actions. Let's take as an example this image, the one on the left, on page 36 of that edition, illustrating the narration of the facts of New Spain when the Spaniards burned Americans alive in order to spread terror. The serene and dignified expression of the victims, the position of their bodies, and the actions of the perpetrators are clearly similar to the engravings in Protestant martyrologies, as this one you can see on the right from John Fox's Book of Martyrs, first published in 1563 and extremely popular throughout Northern Europe. The massacres of Americans were also represented as hunting scenes. When Las Casas narrates the killings perpetrated by Spaniards in La Hispaniola, he describes the atrocities with synergetic metaphors. The Indians appeared as hunted animals, the murderers are assimilated to their dogs of prey because of their shared ferocity, in a topos coming from classical representations of human massacres. According to Las Casas, I quote, "All the people that could run away would hide in the mountains and the hills, in a flight from such inhuman men, lacking piety, ferocious like beasts, enemies of mankind that would teach their terrible dogs to tear apart any Indian they saw in an instant." A few years later, when Antonio Herrera y Tordesillas published his general history of the facts of the Castilians in the islands and mainland of the ocean, he referred to the fact that, I quote, "Vasco Núñez de Balboa sent for the dogs to be thrown against the chieftain's brothers and other prisoners who practiced the nefarious sin." The passage was illustrated by this engraving, also featured in the exhibition. The destruction of American communities was also depicted as a hellish experience. This, of course, was not new. Several massacres from the Old World had been represented in that fashion. In most cases, the depiction of mass killings as a scene from hell tended to justify the fact. Here, we can see an image painted by Giorgio Vasari in 1572 as a decoration for the Sala Regia in the Vatican, where he tried to portray the conflicts of his time in which the Catholic cause was at stake. For this reason, next to a panoramic view of the Battle of Lepanto, he included 3 frescoes with scenes of the religious wars in France. The fresco here that depicts Admiral Coligny's assassination shows perpetrators as heroes and victims transformed into demons. But the representation of massacres in America brought about a decisive innovation. Bartolomé de las Casas described the slaughters that took place in Nueva España as infernal, but it was the Spaniards who became hellish creatures, while the Americans were instead innocent victims of their infernal fury. I quote, "A Christian captain completed endless and iniquitous wars and infernal massacres, and he put that entire territory under the unbearable tyrannical serfdom that all Christian tyrants wish for those people in the Indies." When these scenes were engraved by de Bry, the infernal model was clearly Northern European, as you can see from the image on the right, which is from a painting by Lucas Cranach. There is another aspect of violence in the Americas that cannot be left outside our scope: the unbearable situation of African slaves captured from their communities, sold near the coast, transported across the Atlantic, and forced to live and work in inhuman conditions in their destinations, who were represented many times. But slavery was also a reality for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The 3rd book of The History of the Two Indies by Raynal opens with this engraving representing a scene of slave trade. In the background, half-naked chained men unload the boats docked in the port. In the foreground, a white man sells a woman also chained and half naked, who cries inconsolably. The price is a bag of gold. The caption reads, "An Englishman from Barbados sells his lover." A passage from the text further describes the facts. After a shipwreck, one of the sailors was rescued by an American woman who fed him, cared for him, and after a while took him back to the coast. As soon as they reached the port, the monster sold the woman who had helped him keep his life, who had given him his heart, who with all the feelings and treasures of love. According to Raynal, this episode was transformed into a play by an English poet who, I quote, immortalized this infamous moment to avarice, this infamous monument to avarice and perfidy for posterity, end quote. It is a tale of Yariko and Inkle, which was narrated for the first time in 1657 and later on transformed into an opera. There were, of course, many instances of resistance in which African slaves, in collaboration with Americans, fought against their exploitation. In 1792, Captain J.G. Stedman published in London his narrative of a 5-year expedition against the revolted Negroes of Suriname, illustrated with engravings by William Blake. This is an example which you can also see in the exhibition. Stedman tells the story of the brutal repression of maroon communities, groups of slaves that escaped inland to live in freedom and fight against the Dutch. Although it is possible that the author was a supporter of reform rather than abolition, his book was soon vindicated by those who were active in the campaigns to put an end to slavery. But maroonage was not the only expression of resistance. Between 1791 and 1804, Haiti witnessed a successful insurrection of self-liberated slaves against colonial rule that led to the island's independence. It was the only slave uprising that culminated in an independent state, free from slavery and ruled by former captives. Jean-Baptiste Belay, who we can see here, a former slave, later infantry captain of the rebel forces, became a deputy to the National Convention in Paris, where he spoke in the session that voted to abolish slavery on February the 4th, 1794. Anne-Louis Giraudet de Roussy-Triosson painted this portrait, in which Belay conveniently rests his elbow next to a bust of Raynal, who had warned the Europeans, and I quote, that your slaves stand in no need of either your generosity or your counsel in order to break the sacrilegious yoke of their oppression. Nature speaks a more powerful language than philosophy or interest. These are so many indications of the impending storm, and the Negroes only want a chief sufficiently courageous to lead them to vengeance and slaughter. Where is this great man that nature owes to its oppressed and tormented children? He will appear and he will rise the sacred penance of freedom, end quote. The movement suffered a serious blow when Napoleon ordered the invasion of the island in 1802. Belay and Toussaint Louverture, leader of the rebellion, died in prison. Years later, in 1825, Charles X imposed crippling war reparations and further impoverished the Free State of Haiti. Despite those terrible facts, the independence of Haiti radicalized the idea of universal human rights because free slaves and their American companions imposed their liberty and the abolition of slavery on the French colonists and administrators that attempted to curtail it. So let's end. I have walked you through a collection of texts and images, terrible and beautiful, regarding the American peoples, violence amongst them, and violence against them. All of these images and texts were produced by Europeans between the end of the 15th century and the end of the 18th century. Several are part of Reinventing the Americas, some even with the Nilsson-Baniwas interventions that question them and bring them back to life. It is a contradictory array of representations devised with opposing intentions in different times and contexts with diverse approaches and consequences. They show power and resistance, stereotype and novelty, fantasy and reality. Their authors attempted to portray the world and to shape it, to dominate the people in the in America and to fight for their freedom. Not only that, but the experience and the image of Americans and of violence in the Americas had noticeable effects in Europe and in the political and religious clashes that were taking place there. In any case, those images point to a European difficulty in the representation of otherness, but they also prove that the attempts to overcome those difficulties did not always lead to the same results. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to hear from Thomas Cummings, who is the director of Dumbarton Oaks and the Dumbarton Oaks Professor of the History of Pre-Columbian and Colonial Art in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. He is the author, editor, and co-editor of 10 books, the latest of which is Sacred Matters, Animacy and Authority in the Americas from 2020.
Well, thank you for being here on a beautiful Friday morning. Of course, it's always beautiful in Los Angeles, but it's also just a great pleasure to be here at the Getty again and to work with this wonderful crew at the GRI, and I really thank Idurre for inviting me to return here. Like Nicolas, I had the great pleasure right before the pandemic to be out here and to look at this splendid collection, a growing collection of books concerning early America and thinking about how to present them and to talk about them. And so I begin this morning, and the title of my talk is The Topsy-Turvy Images of America and the Place of You. And you'll see why, well, I say this, I don't even know how to translate topsy-turvy in Spanish or any other language, but I use it because I start with Torres Garcia's well-known print. It's both simple, yet it's quite disquieting, as one must assume a viewing position that goes against the norm. And that's what I want to do today. We can see it, therefore, simply perhaps as an artistic gesture, and once turning away from it, we can return to our accustomed ways of viewing the world. Our, that is, Western, North American, European, omniscient viewing position requires that the North is at the top of the page, and not the South, as is inverted here. There are, of course, all kinds of implicit biases as one moves from North to South, and Nicholas has just referred to some of them. One is you become smaller, you become dumber, you become impotent. There's a whole set of biases that from the 16th century until today talk about the tropics. And the tropics really is not about the tropics. It's about moving out of Europe that are implicit in the way we view the world. There are, as I say, these implicit biases, including the eventual historical division of America into the Americas, done by Anglophone America. That is, it wasn't always the Americas, it was America. But that's not what I want to discuss today. Rather, I'll start with the earliest image of America and work towards how it slowly expanded in cartography and paintings so as to naturalize viewing positions that are derived from conquest and the colonial enterprise. And I'm focused on just a few places, but with multiple representations of them. And by that, I hope to demonstrate how our subject position of seeing, and therefore knowing places, before ever even visiting them is conditioned, first of all, from a Western phenomenological position of approach to them. And that this is, in the main, based on the very trajectory of colonial violent conquest, as we just heard about. That is, the witnessing, seeing places, implicates in image the viewer in an autopic position. That is, you are implicated in those images. And that's different than looking at other kinds of images, because you are situated there. And so I begin with the very first image of America. It's the well-known line drawing by Christopher Columbus, which depicts simply the northern coast of Hispaniola, which was Haiti, becomes Haiti. It is, by what it will become, a beautiful gesture made to indicate the topography of where the land meets the water. It is incomplete, as what else there is for Columbus is unknown. Very different than his text, which is so assertive. It is as disquieting in simplicity as Torres Garcia's print is, but for very different reasons. The coastal outline sketched by Columbus was made during his second voyage in 1493. The same year, his letter describing his first voyage, and which we've already talked about what he saw, whom he met, was published 4 times. It was a bestseller right away in Spain, Italy, Basel, Rome. The consequences of that narrative are why we are here today. It spread that knowledge, first of all, to people who would never see America. But as we see here, it is a place that promises but is unknown. It can't be seen. Words of Columbus are not the same as the image he presents to himself, and so it was never published. And I turn, therefore, from that cover where there's people, there's a trireme here, and Columbus himself coming ashore, natives running to meet with him as he brings a glass vessel, and he's receiving gold. That's in the narrative. None of that is implied in the visual image. Rather, the coast is the northern coast. It looks to the north, and everything to the south is still unknown. I turn then to an image only 6 years later, or thereabouts, in which we see one of the first world maps. This is the Continental Planisphere, or Contino's world map, circa 1500, that then is stolen or traded out of Portugal into Italy. I won't go into the history, it's well known. But this is one of the first world maps that begins to flesh out what Columbus had begun. The island of Cuba and Hispaniola, that Columbus' sketch only hints at, now are fully circumscribed and detailed in terms of their size and relationship to each other. We begin to see more and more in a topic kind of way, witnessing that topography and geography. Even Florida can be recognized here. But more importantly, for what America was to become and was to speak is also seen here. One sees the appearance of the unknown coast of Brazil. It, like the incomplete sketch of Columbus, only hints at a tropical unknown interior that is indicated simply by trees, from which Brazil, of course, receives its name, and parrots, that ubiquitous index of feathers that are worn and that Nicholas had just talked about. But there are no people, there are no buildings, as there are in Europe, rather just a verdant land waiting to be known and to be possessed. The index of possession is also present in this map, marked by the imaginary line of the most consequential performative speech act in world history. It's what creates the America we inhabit. It is the line drawn after the Treaty of Tordesillas that joined Portugal and Spain in agreement as to how the world was to be divided. For example, one cannot even imagine how Brazil and its relationship to Africa would have been in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and 19th and 20th centuries, if the line had been further east. And when I call it a performative speech act, I'm talking about Austin's linguistic notion of speech act, in which saying something transforms in reality the world, and that's what happened. And I simply show here the document drawn up between these two kingdoms in Iberia and mediated by the Pope in Rome. None of them would ever be there. But it's a document that determined the future that we inhabit today, but which did not anticipate the land that is marked on the map. The Spanish thought that they had it all. So the rest is equally known. And this, of course, is the line, as you see here. I don't want to, I hope, well, I'm not sure which is this. I'm not going to, but that blue line is that imaginary line drawn by the Treaty of Tordesillas. And this is all well known, but it's something really critical to remember when we think about the image of America, both as image, text, and a reality. And so the rest, as I said, is well known because we see Waldemüller's map, or at least one of his editions, the Gore, actually, for a globe, in which a world map is made about 2 years later than what we just, Cantino's map. It includes the lands that were becoming better known. And he placed the name America after Amerigo Vespucci, as is well known. And we see it, what is, just, if I could, oh yeah. Well, if I can find it on the map, yeah, so it's over here. And so we see it there. And if we look at the detail of Waldemüller's map and the Cantino map, we can see that there is a difference because the outline of the shore is now filled in as an odd triangular shape. It is now a solid mass, still unknown, but not indeterminate. And it is given a Portuguese name. Well, it's not a Portuguese name, but a Portuguese explorer. And what that means is that this shape, which is the indeterminate one that is created by the line of Tordesillas, becomes this solid area. It declares itself as such, and we move from the Ptolemaic maps of old into a realm as a new world is included. And what we see by that is this great map, world map of 1506, which in Latin is declared down below as cut off, but the world and all it sees on a plain map, Europe, Libya, i.e. Africa, Asia, and the anthropods, the poles and zones and sites of places and parallels for the climes of a mighty globe. Giovanni Matteo Contarini, famed in the Ptolemaic art, has compiled and marked it out. Whither away, stay, traveler, and behold new nations and a newfound world. That is, the mapmaker addresses directly the viewer, telling him or her to look, to see. And what do you see? A new world, America. And what is this new world? It is a world to be possessed. It is a world to be conquered. And how do we know this? Here we see Hispaniola and Cuba, now fully articulated in relationship to each other. But also what we see in Latin written above them is that these are the islands that were conquered, dominated by Christopher Columbus for Spain. Text and image here relate geography and history and conquest on this map. And Contarini addresses the viewer directly to tell them to look. You are positioned to see and to acknowledge history in terms of geography. So, that Latin text written next to Hispaniola is the sketch of Columbus now completed. These are the islands that Columbus subjugated for Spain in 1492, 1493. But now I want to move back to the Caribbean and to look at Pedro Martínez de Anguirre 1511 map, which is what you see here. And the world and our view is beginning to shift, even though this is the map of the New World as recently discovered, and that's what it says on the page. Because here you see the island of Hispaniola, the island of Cuba, and then the sketch of Columbus is repeated. But now it's the coastal outline of the Caribbean mainland, which will become known as the Virreinato de Mexico. Behind this line is again land unknown, but like Hispaniola, it will soon be filled in. As 8 years later, Cortez and his troops, as we know, and eventually his Tlaxcalan allies, conquered the great city of Tenochtitlan. That is, you will move from the unknown into what is to become known. That is, I compare these two maps and we can see how slowly the world is beginning to be filled in. But one of the things that I will ask you to think about and position yourself is that if you look at the map drawn by Columbus, it is a north-south orientation on the page, top to bottom. If you look at the map that is drawn by Getty, it is now east-west. You're moving out of the Caribbean and towards the coast of the mainland. North is to the top, but the main area that we are oriented towards is what is to come. So what is important here is that the view of the coast now shifts. That is, the coastal outline is no longer oriented from Cuba and Hispaniola looking west. Rather, it is now oriented on the page, so the orientation here, in this map, I'm sorry, let me go back. With the publication of Cortez's account in Nuremberg of the conquest, includes the most famous map, perhaps, of the conquest of America. It is the most famous map of any in Mexico, but really any of America. And it's been endlessly studied and argued about. And I shall return to the map of the city itself in just a second. But what's equally important is what it does with the map of the Caribbean. We now have the shift of how we view the coast. That is, the coastal outline is no longer oriented from Cuba and Hispaniola looking west. Rather, it is now oriented on the page, so the orientation is from Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. This may not seem important, but it's a radical shift in the narrative of America and American conquest, as it begins to become ever more the subject of the narrative and orientation of view that is chronicles, history, people. Everybody is moving out of the Caribbean into the mainland. So you're moving, that is, from west to east, And here you see this image of the Punta de Cuba, that's all you see, the end of Cuba, and you move into the coast of Mexico. It is a reorientation. It's very simply done, but Mexico now becomes represented more often than not than we see the Caribbean. And this is the great image of Cortez. The viewpoint is more or less seen at the bottom of the page, south to north, although it's not really, because you have the sun coming up between the two towers of the twin temples of the Temple Mayor, but that's not actually where it's oriented in this map. It's completely askew. So as we're looking now oriented in Tenochtitlan north to south, is determined by the approach of the Spaniards, actually. And it takes, and this is the approach that they see Mexico City from first time, as they arrive from the coast, traveling east to west across the pass into the city, as described Bernal Diaz del Castillo. If you read it, you can almost imagine yourself seeing this. What he says is too beautiful to describe. I don't have enough words. It's something like out of the book of Amadeus. But the approach is not precisely this, but it is coming through the pass, past Popocatépetl, and then looking at and down at Mexico City. The point is that this becomes the viewpoint of Mexico City forever. And as I said, it's not a precise orientation of an actual approach, but it's rather it situates the viewer to the orientation of an approach that is about the domination of a place. This place is about to disappear. Tenochtitlan will be razed to the ground, and it will be rebuilt as Mexico City. But it doesn't change the orientation. This is how you're going to see it. This is the circa 1550 map of Santa Cruz that was sent to Charles V. And it was then amended and described by his royal geographer, Santa Cruz, in which he employs the king, or the emperor, to look at the city that he has conquered. That is what is written in the gold down at the bottom left of the page. That is, the text itself is telling you what I just told you. I didn't need to, actually, I could have just read it. That is, you own this. This is yours. This is European. And it is the same orientation, if we go back, that Cortez gives us, basically. And why I say that is you can see the dike that's built below, and you see the dike, again, right here at the bottom. This separates the two bodies of water in the lake. And, you know, Barbara Mundy has described these maps, and I'm not going to go into that. It's a wonderful book. But my point here is the iteration and reiteration of the same position of the viewer towards a place. And that place is the place of Bernal Diaz del Castillo, of Cortez, and of every conqueror and colonizer to see the city. And so you see the center of the city, et cetera. And this goes on and on and on. These are the two maps of the center of the city with the cathedral and the palace of the gobernador, and it is the same direction. It is taken from the same viewpoint again and again. And you see it again and again and again. This is the I think it's 23 representation of Mexico City, showing the same viewpoint and orientation of Juan Gomez de Trasmonte and others who, and there's a whole iteration of these, all of them taking the same subject position. the same utopic position that you are taking and I am taking as we look at Mexico City. This is how you think of Mexico City. And of course, Cortez's map is repeated again and again and again. The north-south orientation in the representation of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, was conceived as a kind of, Tenochtitlan, should I say, doesn't naturally have this kind of orientation and representation. If we take into account the fact that Tenochtitlan was a kind of axis mundi with the Templo Mayor, this temple right at the top there, was a kind of axis mundi at the center of the universe. Because if we look at it differently as a cosmogram from the Fèche-Mayer, we see the center and the four cardinal directions of this Borgia corpus of manuscripts, this one from the Codex Fèche-Mayer. But the point here is that if we look at the directionality of this flat image of the cosmos, east is at the top, west is on the bottom, north on the left, and south on the right. This is a completely different orientation of representation of the cardinal directions than is being taken in European representations of Tenochtitlan. The point is that once the orientation becomes fixed, as it was for Mexico City, it is always seen from that perspective. So let us look at South America and some of its earliest images, because we'll see something very different, but in line with the utopic position of conquest. The earliest extensively illustrated book, and I assume we have a Cieza, I don't know if it's in the exhibition or not, of Cieza de Leon is 1553, published in Seville. Almost all the images of places and people are incredibly fanciful. As you see here, his image of Cusco. The only thing he gets right here is that the Inca emperor has a red fringe, but whoever was making this image read the text and put that on him. Otherwise, he's dressed in a Roman toga, etc. The city itself is a walled European city, just as he depicts Lake Titicaca here with European boats and walled cities all around the lake. This has nothing to do with reality. But the most faithful image of any topographical feature in America appears in this book. That is the image of Cerro de Potosí. This is a real image drawn by somebody who has been there and who knows Potosí. This is a photograph of the Red Mountain, as it's called, because it's covered with hematite. The black and white would not show that. But what you see here is his image of Potosí, and it's the fabulous silver mine that was only found by the Spanish in 1545. It is seen from a particular vantage point. It is the vantage point as one approaches from the north going south. That's what this photograph is taken from. That's what his Cerro de Potosí image is taken from. Already, the image depicts mining and the veins in the hills, as we see here, the Veta de Esteban, et cetera, et cetera. These are private veins in the mountains. You also see here people going, indigenous people going up to mine them, up the paths leading up, going from 12,000 feet upwards. And this is a city that in 1545 didn't exist, and as we all know, by 1600, it has a population of over 100,000 inhabitants. It has mirrors that are being brought from Venice. It has incredible textiles from China, etc. It is incredibly fabulously wealthy, and this image is a faithful image of that place, unlike any other that I know of in the 16th century of America. Everybody talks about Potosi. Cervantes has a whole play about the richness of Peru and the silver that comes from it. He also mentions it in Don Quixote, and there's an expression, vale un Peru, vale un Potosi. But this image is the image that is concretized in how we see it from north to south. Another image. I'm just going to go through a couple of these. Again, looking towards the Twin Mountains, with the llamas going up and all of the places entering into the mines. This is a place where indigenous peoples, the Mita of Potosi, that is the labor of Potosi, those who went into the mine stayed for 7 days and then came out because it wasn't cost effective enough to have people coming in and out of the mines. You can imagine what that was like. 1/4 of the population of the southern Sierras of Peru was traveling to, at, or traveling from Potosi in any one day. Again, a 1590 representation, same orientation, same profile, city below, but here you have the industrialization of the mint and the production of the ore here. And you can see that this artist, using color, has depicted the red of the red mountain of the hematite. Even in terms of fanciful images of the Virgin and the image of Potosi, it's still the same. It has now become a religious image as well. And I'm not going to go into the text, but this has to do with the papal donation as expressed and talked about by Nicholas of the Pope, the donation of the world to the Spanish. And that's what you see here. This is a whole implicit mythology, but it is the conquest. This is a 1701 image of Potosi, just as you see from the 1553 image, except cast in silver from the silver mine that was taken to Spain, which is and it was commissioned by the bishop at Potosi for his own hometown, and is the base of a statue of the Virgin that he venerated. But it's exactly the same. It has all of the two mountains as you see it. This is what faces the congregation in Spain. The Virgin sits on top of it, just like this. And here, however, you have people going up to mining it, taking out the silver, but this is made of that silver. Potosi is the only place that is depicted from a north-south orientation in the Andes. And that orientation is the approach that is seen by the vast movement of peoples and goods who enter into the city and take the silver out of it. Of course, the road to Potosi continues to Sucre, Chuquisaca, that goes past Potosi, but that view is never depicted. I never even took a photograph of it either until I realized I should have. That is, you never take it from south to north. It is not the iconic image. And that is really interesting because it is the only orientation of a place in Peru that has a north to south. Because if we look at the earliest maps of Peru, we see a completely different orientation. if we look at this 1570s map of Huaracherí, the area of Huaracherí, which was created for by Damian Bandera, we see a different orientation. It is a west at the bottom and east at the top. Or topographically, we are looking from the Pacific into the Andes. This orientation is followed in almost all views of Andean cities, be they maps, plans, or images. And so, as you can see, there is the ocean at the bottom. You can see the Andes at the top, and what you probably can't read, but you have one of the great images or deities in the Andes, Pariacaca, who is mentioned in one of the great mythologies of the Andes written in Quechua, the only one written in Quechua, and it says the stairs to Pariacaca right at the top. And see if I can put it right there. It's right there. That's the road that leads past out of Lima and into, well, actually it's going from Pachacamac all the way up to Pariacaca, and then it goes all the way to Cusco. But the point is, you are going up the page, but you're going up the page, you're also going up the mountains. You're going west to east. And we see this again and again. So if we take the most famous manuscript written by an Andean, Huamampoma's world map, in the Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, even the world is compressed this way. You go from the ocean with the boats, the fish, etc. As you move up the world, you go into the mountains. This is Mapamundi. This is his imaginative map of the world, but it has the same orientation as does Bandera's map. And he didn't see this. And you again see it, for example, in the 18th century map of Callao, done by Amédée Fraisier, in which these maps and all his images are in Paris. They were printed, but you see them here. This is Callao again. This is the city that was completely wiped out by an earthquake and then a tsunami in the 18th century. But right before he did this. But you're looking from west to east as you go up, and including, if you look at the 1680 painting of the Plaza of Lima, you have the same orientation. You are looking, your back is to the ocean here, and your view is across the plaza, and you can see the beginning of the Andes as you move upwards and inwards to the high plains. Even the absurd image of Cusco that was in Borbone's first image that he created in the 16th century has the same orientation. It is at the bottom of the page, you would be in the west, and you would move into the city. Believe me, Cusco never looked like this, except that it did have Sacsayhuaman to the north, which is this tiered fortress-like edifice up here. So you know the orientation that you're looking at. And then you have the mountains in the back. By the way, this is the image of Cusco that's you see everywhere. It's the only one you really see. There is no really picture of Cusco except for the earthquake, and that actually reverses. It's the only one that reverses the direction, and there's a reason for that which I won't go into. This is very different than what happens in Mexico. What you see here on the right is the description of the valley of the Chimo, and the city of Trujillo, that's on the right. And of course, again, you see the ships in the ocean, at the bottom of the page, indicating the west, the Pacific, and as you move up the river that's coming out of the Andes, you get to the Andes. Very different than what you see on the left, which is the image of Acapulco. That is, you're coming out of Mexico City, and you are looking into the Pacific, from which the Manila galleon arrives. You're looking, if you imagine yourself the horseman there, looking from east to west. These are inverted positions. So Adrian Booth's image of 1638, as I said, looks east to west to the sea. But the coastal compression of Peru and the dramatic rise of the Andes and then the impenetrable Amazon creates a phenomenological experience that places the colonizer in only one vantage point, and that is you arrive from the west. Yes, west. I'm dyslexic. That is, you're always coming by boat, or you can come by land, but everything is coming really from the boat. Hence, you see the ships at the bottom. Hence, you see the Pacific, the west, as you arrive. That is the position of the conqueror. That is the position of the European as they see this. And I will say that that is really a radically different way of phenomenologically experiencing space and direction if you are a Quechua speaker. You do not see the world that way. You stand and you look, depending on time of day. I can't go into the semantic, the syntax and semantics of it, but the bodily understanding of how you speak and see where you are in the land is diametrically opposed. That is, you are taking, we are taking, as we look at this, a subject position of the people who came from Europe, who go to Peru, just as you take the subject position of Cortés, Bernal Diaz, etc., as you look at Mexico, as you look at Acapulco. I will end with one really odd part of this, and that is the Rio de la Plata, as you see here, by Blau, from 1640, and the inconsequential city of Buenos Aires until the 19th century. I hate to say that, but it really wasn't that important. But it was represented. Now, the Rio Plata is a beautiful river, and to the north is it actually creates the border, the area of Guarani and Tucumán, as you see here, but it now is, you cross the river and you go into Uruguay. But what's really confounding here, not the grid system of which all Spanish cities are placed, and which is really fantastic for Buenos Aires. As you see, it looks to the river from a northern position, or at least you suppose it is, because it is towards the top of the page, looking down towards the river. And this is a normal way of looking at it. You see the boats here. So one assumes, if you don't know where you are, that Buenos Aires is on the north bank of the Rio Plata. And I'm just going to show you these different images that I've taken from these are all in Seville at the Archive of the Indies. Another one, all repeated. But Buenos Aires is not on the northern side of the river. It is on the southern side of the river. And if you were to study just the maps, your subject position would be completely wrong in terms of where you're orienting yourself. The only map that I found in the 17th, well, there's more, that is correct, is a French one of the plan of the city of Buenos Aires, which actually puts it at the bottom of the page, indicating how you're looking. You're looking north. All the others invert it. I don't have a complete explanation of why this is done, except to say that it's always looking north to the south, as I described at the beginning. And to get it right, you're looking south to the north. So when I began this talk, I thought, my God, Torres Garcia got it right from the very beginning, that he is just repeating an historical trope about how one places oneself in the world according to the way you see it on the maps that you are given. But in most cases, it is an orientation that takes you bodily into a space that is historical, that is based upon conquest, and a European sense of propriety of space. And those are the views of America that becomes the Americas. Thank you.
We have now a 15-minute break before we go to the next speaker. So if you want to have some coffee and come back in 15 minutes, thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Now we're gonna hear from Daniela Bleichmar, who is a professor of art history and history at the University of Southern California. Bleichmar's research addresses the histories of art and science in colonial Latin America and early modern Europe. Her publications include Visible Empire, Botanical Expeditions and Visual Culture in the Hispanic Enlightenment from 2012, and Visual Voyages, Images of Latin American Nature from Columbus to Darwin from 2017.
Thank you, Idurre. Let me start my timer. Thank you, Idurre, so much for the invitation. I am really delighted to be here, to come back after that first conversation about this show some years ago. And thank you also to Thisbe and the amazing team that planned this meeting. What an incredible opportunity to be at the Getty today and to see these two exhibitions, Reinventing the Americas and the Códice Maya de Mexico, is really incredible and exciting. And I'll say that as some of you who know me know, I've been working for some years on a book about the Codex Mendoza, a third of which you see here. And it was a project that started at the Getty Research Institute when I was a scholar there, is when it first began, and this is from the last chapter. So it feels very special to be back at the Getty as this project comes to an end. So the exhibition that brings us together today, the exhibition Reinventing the Americas, addresses two related and important questions. The first question is a historical one. What visions of the Americas and indigenous Americans did European books and prints articulate from the 16th to the 19th century? And the exhibition explores this question guided by the revelatory insight that the Mexican historian Edmundo O'Gorman offered in his 1958 book, La Invención de América, translated into English 2 years later. O'Gorman argued that European texts and images did not describe territories, peoples, and the natural world of the Americas, but rather invent them. That the issue was not one of representation, but rather of construction. To this we can add that, as we have heard this morning and seen from the show, European Americana tells us as much, if not more, about Europe and Europeans than about the Americas and indigenous Americans. The second question that the exhibition poses is a methodological one. How do curators, scholars, artists work not only with, but also through and against archives and collections? How do we address silences, omissions, erasures, and extract new insights from archives and collections that were formed at particular times and with particular motivations and constraints? Collections have possibilities as well as limits. And the very rich collection that this exhibition is based on, like most comparable collections at major research institutions in the US, consists of what specialists call European Americana. In other words, European constructions of the Americas. European Americana privilege certain objects, but not others, and narrate a specific story from a particular point of view, as Tom just showed us. In this exhibition, curator Idurre Alonso thoughtful response to the problem of archival silences, omissions, and distortions was to invite the contemporary artist Denilson Beniwa to insert his own work, which talks back to the archive in rich and illuminating ways. Creating a present-day response to the historical archive of European Americana is one way to respond to the limitations and biases of that archive. Another possibility is to show that the archive of European Americana is itself a contingent and partial historical construction rather than the story. A collection of European Americana could give one the erroneous notion that only Europeans created images and texts about the Americas in this period. But not all inventions and reinventions of the Americas were created in Europe or by Europeans. Under Spanish colonial rule, indigenous, mestizo, criollo, Spanish-American authors and artists actively contributed to the reinvention of the Americas, as did citizens of the independent nation-states in the 1800s. And the images on the screen are just some examples of the many examples of what we could call American Americana, produced between the 1540s and the 1850s. In addition to such drawings, prints, and paintings, many indigenous objects were sent and taken from the Americas to Europe in the early modern period, an important material archive that created its own set of European responses. In a recent article, I showed the ways in which these and other objects were reinvented in European collections from early modern cabinets to modern museums, a process of constant interpretive instability and mutability through which the Tupinamba feather cape that you see on the screen could be described as having belonged to the Mexica ruler Moctezuma, while a Mexica chimali, or feather shield, was presented variously as a shield with a dragon, a Chinese sunshade with dragon, and an Indian shield with dragon, identified as Mexican 300 years after its first listing in a European inventory. A mosaic work knife handle characterized in an Egyptianizing move as a sphinx, and a Mexican stone pendant or figurine as an Egyptian head of the sun. And the famous feather work that has often been described as Moctezuma's headdress identifies variously as a Moorish hat, an Indian apron, or a feather work that had belonged to the king of Cuba. In my article, I argued that such fungibility was not an accident of imperfect or insufficient information that over time gave way to more precise and accurate knowledge. The point is not that at first they got it wrong, but over time they knew more, they got it right. It's not a tale of progress. Instead, I propose that such constant malleability is a result of an active interpretive strategy that involved the production of geographical and cultural specificity through which non-European objects in European cabinets remain always imprecise, changing, and interchangeable. The majority of indigenous objects could be endlessly reinterpreted in collections, moving from one characterization to the next with astonishing flexibility. But there was a particular type of object that resisted interpretation, and those were indigenous manuscripts, documents known today as codices. Manuscripts containing indigenous pictography remained from the 1520s to the mid-1800s almost entirely illegible. The Codex Vienna, for instance, is believed to be among the earliest Mexican indigenous objects to arrive in Europe, perhaps as early as 1520, has extremely well-documented collection history that has traced its circulation between 1521 and 1678, from Portugal to Rome to Central Europe, then Munich, Weimar, finally Vienna, where it has been since 1678. The Codex attracted the attention of scholars and collectors, including the Danish physician Ole Worm, who mentioned it in his 1655 publication, Worm's Museum, or History of Rare Things. Worm never saw the Vienna Codex, but he received a drawing from a correspondent, the German scholar Job Ludolf, who was a foremost expert on Ethiopia in 17th century Europe. Ludolf examined the codex in Munich in 1650 and copied some figures from the lower portion of plate 12. He sent his drawings to Worm, who included woodcuts reproducing Ludolf's figures and a short textual entry in a chapter on artificialia, or human-made things, a category that Nicolas mentioned, in which he lists written works from outside Europe, including books in Japanese and Chinese characters. But when it came to interpreting the Mexican pictography, Worm had very little to say, admitting that neither he nor anyone else had any idea what these images communicated. He described the figures as Mexican hieroglyphs established with astonishing figures depicted in various colors from which hardly anyone has deduced anything. Though he did make an interesting connection because he continued, they had great affinity with certain figures among those that the extremely renowned gentleman Johannes de Laet depicted in Book 5, Chapter 10 of his description of the West Indies. So he said, I have no idea what these mean, but they do seem to connect to others that I saw in another book, and I will be discussing that other book shortly. Unlike Worm, the Bolognese collector Ferdinando Cospi did possess a Mexican codex in his famous cabinet, which is depicted here in an engraving included in the 1677 publication of the Museo Cospiano. The manuscript is known after this owner as the Codex Cospi, and some of you will recognize not only that this is a facsimile, but that it was photographed in the reading room of the Getty Research Institute. A few isolated drawings from the Codex appear in the 1677 catalog, where it is characterized as a libro mexicano, Mexican book, and the figures are described as Mexican hieroglyphs, which are the most extravagant figures and for the most part depict strangely monstrous men and animals. In other passage, the author admits, what they mean, I do not know, nor do I know of others in Europe who know it, not having yet found anyone who has mentioned them and shed any light on them. It would be a beautiful and curious undertaking for someone to shed light on the darkness shrouding these literary mysteries, not yet explained in Europe. So Mexican indigenous pictorial manuscripts resisted interpretation. They were constantly reinvented and translated into monsters, hieroglyphs, Egyptian, Chinese, and almost without exception, reduced Europeans through pronouncing them illegible, uninterpretable, unknowable. But there was one exception. The only indigenous manuscript that was legible to early modern Europeans was the manuscript known as the Codex Mendoza. It was painted and narrated by indigenous people only a few decades after the fall of Tenochtitlan and the instauration of Spanish colonial rule. It is an example of some of the ways in which indigenous makers not only recorded, but also actively remade their history and culture for a colonial and a European audience. This manuscript was produced expressly for export to send to Europe a Mexica account of Mexica history. And it was one of multiple manuscripts created in what is now Mexico between the 1540s and the 1580s to provide information about indigenous cultures before and after Spanish colonization, works that Elizabeth Boone has aptly characterized as the descendants of Aztec pictography. Unlike pre-contact indigenous pictography, which was entirely illegible to early modern Europeans, these works could be read, looked at, and understood, as they all included texts in a European language, either Spanish or Latin, and most use a pictorial language that included, to some degree, Western imagery. But while these manuscripts could be interpreted, we have very little evidence that they actually were studied and used in this period. And again, there is just one exception. The single Mexican indigenous manuscript that was not only legible, but actually read, translated, reproduced repeatedly in this period was the Codex Mendoza. Sent from Mexico to Spain, the Mendoza appears not to have arrived at its intended destination, and somehow, there's a story of pirates, ended up in Paris, then London, then Oxford, where it remains to this day. One of its owners, the English cleric Samuel Purchas, included a reproduction of the Codex in his collection of travel documents, Purchas His Pilgrims, published in 4 massive volumes in 1625. The engraved frontispiece to the work includes a portrait of the author. I think of him as a global sandwich, with 2 hemispheres to either side, and announces the goal of the publication, explaining that it contains, quote, a history of the world in sea voyages and land travels with the world of the world's rarities, are by a world of eyewitness authors related to the world. In the 3rd volume, Book 5, Chapter 7, Purchas reproduces the Mendoza, and this is the longest chapter in the entire volume. The volume is about 1,000 pages, and this chapter is the longest of all, extending over 53 pages. It is also the most heavily illustrated in the entire publication, in all of 4 volumes. And the title of the chapter is very interesting. The history of the Mexican nation, described in pictures by the Mexican author, explaining the Mexican language, which expositions translated into Spanish and thence into English, together with the said picture history are here presented. So there's great attention to the process through which the work was manufactured in a colonial context, with indigenous paintings accompanied by an indigenous narrative in Nahuatl, and this in turn translated into Spanish text that was again translated into the English text that Purchas published. In other words, the process of continuous reinvention and translation is one that was not invisible, it was very much the point that Purchas was making. This is the first publication of a complete American indigenous manuscript in Europe, and there is no other manuscript fully reproduced in print for another 200 years. Purchas made the Mendoza the only legible and accessible Native American object in the early modern period. It was the only item in Purchas's extensive collection to receive this treatment, and he described it as the choicest of my jewels. What Purchas did was create not a facsimile, but a translation. This is not a copy, but rather a reproduction. And the vocabulary of original and copy that is so central to the making of early modern images and things, from prints to sculptural casts to replicas, is not the most useful for us here. Nor is the idea of printed images as fixed, identically reproducible statements that allow for the standardization of information, whether we think of William Ivins or Elizabeth Eisenstein. More useful here is the idea of the remake from film studies, or of the cover from music studies, both of which emphasize not the similarity between the original and other versions, but rather the willful appropriation and reinvention that each later offshoot makes possible, because Purchas' version gave way to many others. So between 1625 and 1831, we have 8 different works, plus 3 translations, so 11 publications that remake the Mendoza, whole or in part. This makes the Codex Mendoza, as far as I know, the single most studied and analyzed non-European object in Europe until the second half of the 1800s. And what happens with this constant reinvention is extremely interesting. Purchas used the Mexican manuscript as the source for the published version, but once the manuscript gave way to print, it disappeared. Although the codex was in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, not a obscure place, and included in its published catalogue, we have no record of anyone consulting it between the time it entered the library in 1659 and 1830. Purchas's version was the one that authors used for their multiple reproductions. So it was a remake that was in turn remade over and over. And so we see the creation of versions with variable content and multiple meanings. The printed version let loose a set of textual and pictorial objects that could be associated in various forms or dissociated to produce versions that are partial, change sequence, create or eliminate possible meanings, and end up producing a sort of interpretive pinball machine, a sort of kaleidoscope of statements. The key version in this story of remakes is Purchas's, as it was the one from which all their authors derived their own. Overall, Purchas's version is strikingly faithful to the original manuscript and communicate a dedicated effort to reproduce rather than recreate it. And I'll just mention that this is extremely rare for Purchas, who has been very harshly criticized by later historians for his liberal editing of the sources that he included in his Pilgrims. There's so many essays or articles by angry scholars who specialize in one part of the world who criticize the way in which he sort of very savagely edited the source describing that part of the world. The title of a 1977 scholarly essay is representative of this opprobrium. The title is Samuel Purchas, the indefatigable encyclopedist who lacked good judgment. But with the Mendoza, Purchas stayed extremely close to the original, or what he understood to be the original. He considered the indigenous paintings to be what he termed a, quote, picture history, and understood the Spanish text to be not an integral part, but rather an extensive commentary, an additional element. So true to this understanding, if not to the manuscript, Purchas's most significant intervention was to alter the relationship between image and text in the manuscript. In the publication, the Spanish glosses that in the manuscript appear next to each single image vanish. The woodcuts replace these annotations with uppercase letters in alphabetical order, which you can see on the screen, keyed to a textual commentary set in italics below or next to the image. So the move distanced image from text, obscuring the Spanish presence within the manuscript itself. And this separation of the pictorial and textual elements is emphasized by the running header for the chapter, which portrays the Mendoza as a Mexican picture history chronicle without writing, despite the abundant presence of words throughout the codex. The transcultural production of the manuscript and the colonial slant of the history are erased from view to provide an idea of the indigenous past as an ending and of indigenous people as always ancient. In an example, as others that have been mentioned earlier today, of what Johannes Fabian and other critics of anthropology have termed the denial of coevalness. Indigenous people were never contemporary, they were always somewhere in the past. Roman letters provide English translations of the Spanish text, and the italics are Purchas's interpretation of the picture. So in effect, there are two voices typographically indicated, but by terming this as a picture history chronicle without words, the Spanish presence is minimized. This despite the fact that Purchas is entirely dependent on the Spanish text to make the figures legible. The relation, he explained, quote, does more fully lay open these things, meaning otherwise I would have no idea. Whatever the Spanish text does not lay open remains shut. Unable to interpret many of the individual images, Purchas writes, quote, all the rest I leave to each reader's own industry and search. As this comparison shows, Purchas was not trying to recreate the manuscript, but rather to make it legible. The composition of the page, the importance of color, the replication of individual figures are not his concern. Much as he minimizes the Spanish authorial presence, the textual translation is much more faithful than the pictorial one. The first person to use Purchas's version, Johannes de Laat, the Dutch geographer, author, and founding member of the Dutch West India Company, drew on Purchas for the second edition of his widely read New World, or Description of the West Indies. De Laat selected portions of the manuscript for use in 2 chapters out of 30, in which he discussed New Spain. Chapter 10, shown here, focuses on language, counting, timekeeping, and the recording of history. It begins with a vocabulary offering Nahuatl terms for parts of the body, colors, various natural things, familiar relations, and numbers, along with their equivalents in a European language, reiterating the primacy of translation for the study of the New World. Unlike Purchas's great attention to Nahuatl pictographs, however, de Laat privileged words over images. He noted that although Aztecs lacked, quote, the art of writing, they managed to record their history, quote, by certain pictures, which are like hieroglyphs. And he reproduced 5 small woodcuts representing dates and quantities. Overall, de Laat is interested in using the Mendoza not to understand pictography, but as a Mexica history that he can compare to 2 famous Spanish histories at the time. So what you see here is these 3 columns in which he compares the rulers of the Mexica Empire according to Gómara, according to Acosta, and according to these painted annals. So the Mendoza becomes one more source for the comparative study of Mexican history rather than a unique indigenous document, as Purchas had considered it. The Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher included or turned to Purchas's Mendoza for comparative material in his Oedipus Aegyptiacus, a characteristically complex work in which Kircher attempted to recover the secrets of ancient Egyptian religion and science by deciphering their hieroglyphic writing. In a detailed comparative analysis, he presented to the reader the compelling case of the supposed relationship between ancient Egyptians and ancient Mexicans based on the parallels between their religious systems. They both constructed pyramidal temples, they both worshipped the sun and the moon, they both wrote in hieroglyphs. Here says, what more evidence do you need that the Aztecs were Egyptians? It's very convincing. And as part of this theater of hieroglyphs, Kircher presented the reader with material that he mined from Purchas Mendoza, focusing on the calendrical system. So while Purchas and de Laat focus on history, Kircher was primarily interested in pictorial writing. I think for reasons of time, I'm going to skip all this, but I wouldn't want to skip this, the use of the Mendoza in the exiled Jesuit Francisco Javier Clavijero's Ancient History of Mexico, extracted from the best Spanish historians and from manuscripts and from the ancient paintings of the Indians published in Italy in 1780. So Clavijero's project was to write a complete history of what he called ancient Mexico, and he followed on the steps of Lorenzo Boturini, the Italian traveler and collector of Mexican indigenous manuscripts, who assembled a gigantic archive of indigenous sources that he described as a Museo Indiano, and which he proposed in his 1746 idea of the new general history of America, that he was proposing not only a new history, but a new historical method which placed indigenous sources as the ultimate and necessary source of Mexican history. Clavijero was the first to suggest that the Codex Mendoza, as we know it, since, had been commissioned by Antonio de Mendoza. Before Clavijero, no one ever calls it Mendoza or connects it to that name. And he characterizes it, as you can see here, as La Raccolta di Mendoza, Mendoza's collection. And he considers it so important as a source for Mexican history that it is the very first item in his list of painted sources that he used for writing this book. But what he does with the images is extremely interesting. The Codex Mendoza was for Clavijero a source to mine for information, not a manuscript to reproduce. The engravings that are included in the publication, which are based on the printed woodcuts that previous authors had published, serve as visual records that document specific historical data. For instance, the designs of military uniforms, shields, and weapons shown here. But the engravings do not attempt to copy the figures in the manuscript, as had been the case until now with all the previous publications. The figures that correspond to names of Mexica rulers and indigenous towns are presented in a European style. It's the content, not the form, that is presented as relevant. So I will not have time today to go through all the interpretations that the different remakes of the Mendoza created, but I think I've given you a sense of the range of possibilities. The Mendoza could be reduced to a few isolated hieroglyphs to serve as evidence of the relative reliability or unreliability of Spanish accounts, as with Johannes de Lat. It could be used as hieroglyphs that provided one among multiple proofs demonstrating that the Aztecs were the descendants of the ancient Egyptians who had migrated to the Americas, as with Curator. It could be a collection of voyages, as with the French compiler Thévenot. An element in the comparative history of world religions, and in particular of debates about squaring the New World with biblical accounts and chronology, as with Warburton. Or, as we were just hearing, with Clavijero, as historical records that would permit the writing of an American-centered history of the Americas, where what others had considered to be global history became patriotic Creole history in a proto-national spirit that would give way to all-out national and nationalistic histories produced after 1821. When what was the Viceroyalty of New Spain became independent Mexico, naming itself after the tribe whose local history is depicted in this manuscript, and choosing as its symbol the eagle standing on top of the prickly pear cactus that named the city of Tenochtitlan. And these fragmentary remakes represent the bulk of the Mesoamerican indigenous archive in early modern global history, and remain so until the study of Mesoamerican pre-Hispanic and colonial codices took off in the second half of the 19th century. It was not until 1831 that Kingsborough's landmark Antiquities of Mexico provided an extensive compilation of the various codices in European collections. The title presents the work as one of facsimile, exact copies from the Latin to make something alike of the same kind. And the very first manuscript of the 9 volumes is the collection of Mendoza, which had by the time become by far the best known and studied Mesoamerican manuscript. And once again, Kingsborough divorced image from text, replacing the alphabetic keys that purchase use with numbers that connect individual figures in the composition to the textual explanations. Strangely, I think, I wanted to put it next. Strangely, what was left in is the autograph by the Mendoza's first recorded European owner, the French cartographer André Thévet, who signed the manuscript in several places. But as you can see, every image is accompanied by alphabetic writing in Spanish, and that writing is entirely removed. There's a lot more that we could say about Kingsborough, but I just want to end by noting that this process of using indigenous objects and indigenous images to reinvent visions of America is one that continues today. I am showing you on the screen the digital Mendoza, produced in collaboration between INA and Oxford, which is described in the website as a digital repatriation. Thank you very much.
So now we're going to have, I think, like a half-an-hour discussion about, and then we're going to have also 10, 15 minutes for questions from the public. And also, if you're joining us via Zoom, you can type your questions as well. So I really like these presentations because they were all very different. And I was trying to think about commonalities in a way and the connections with the exhibition. And I think that there's one thing, which is repetition, that happens in the three cases that you were putting together, which is also the verb that goes together with the exhibition title, right? Repetition and, in some cases, construction. I think, especially in both Tom and Nicolas's presentations, how do you construct this image, right? And so I was thinking about that idea and how in the presentation of Nicolas we have a very clear view of how these images are set and constructed from the very beginning and then repeated over and over again. Throughout centuries. In the case of Tom, it's like an image that starts appearing. So the beginning is not so clear, and it starts becoming a construction through the years. But I wanted to ask you about this idea of repetition, and how is it questioned or is not questioned? How we can have this constructed image repeated for 3 centuries, 4 centuries?
I guess I want to also connect to this, to how much of this is about print and books. It's not the entire story, but it's certainly a big part of the story.
Well, I mean, being older than you guys,
Not by much.
no, sufficient. Is that this idea that you know, as a scholar and as an art historian, and as you accumulate a memory of images, it all of a sudden becomes clear to you as a scholar, and then you begin to work on this issue of what does repetition mean, because you know that you've seen it before. What does seeing something again and again mean? And so the issue that Nicolas brought up, which is the illustration by Idurre of Las Casas, is probably the most repeated body of images that served various needs and purposes that are antithetical to each other, but yet are images that everyone knows and become repeated. And so that by the time you get to the 19th century and the United States goes to war with Spain, one of the very first illustrated anti-Spanish texts and books is, I think it's, well, I know, it's not clear who published it, so I don't want to say, because it's anonymous, incorporates all of the debris drawing, or prints by, from Las Casas to accuse the Spanish of being rapists, pillagers, et cetera, et cetera. But the very first image in the book is a blank page. And it says, and this just says, this image is so horrible that we cannot print it. And then you see all these images that you've seen before. And it is used, of course, to have the North American population really rally against Spain. So, and just as you have of the mirror, the symmetry of the mirror, it is again used for that. So, what repetition is critical to the role that these kinds of, and it is print, that these images have, because it is, to use the term imagined community, it's an imagined community that participates in these images time and time again over history, that allows you to connect back and presently to the condition that you're in. And that's really clear in what you were presenting.
I think also there's, sorry. No, go ahead. I think that we were all talking in one way or another about two separate relationships. One is the relationship between what the image shows and something out there in the world that is being represented. And the other is relationships from image to image, right? Mm. And so they move at different speeds and they don't always move together, I think. Mm. And so part of it is the visual economy of print that is a central practice, is that of reuse, of adaptation, and also of quotation, right? Of images quoting other images, where the relationship between the image and the thing it depicts is not as present. And I think that is very hard. It's a historical relationship to the role of image as representation that is so different from a modern understanding of the role of the image to the thing it depicts, that I think is very, very hard to fully be able to accept that these images were never realistic, were never intended to show things as they exist in the world. They were always meant to construct certain stories.
I would like...
Yeah.
Is Tom going to disagree, or am I? No, what I wanted to add to all your comments is that, of course, in the images, in all the images we've shown, there is repetition, but there is also usage. And in each repetition, each usage transforms the image into something new. Not because the image changes, but because what you try to do with the image, with each of the users of the images, try to do, change the meaning of the image.
Can you give us an
and
example?
The political use of those images.
Give us an example of that.
But not only the image themselves, but also the models on which the images are based. So there are examples in the presentation that I showed that you can represent the same terrible facts with the same models and the same iconography and the same the same patterns that become formulaic, but you are trying to do something different and opposite with them. You are trying to show that the victims of the massacres are responsible for their own faith, but in other usages of the same images and of the same patterns, you are trying to show that they are not, that they are innocent. So also in repetition, by usage, there is change and change in meaning. And also, in the same sense, I think that something that is common to all three presentations is that there is invention in repetition. One of the maps that you showed actually has the word invention in it. And each interpretation of the Codex Mendoza that you showed is an invention of what the Codex is saying. And you can say the same about other interpretations of other images, but also of other objects, as you very well explained. Think, for example, about the interpretations of the quipus. From the very time that a European sees a quipu, he imagines, or she imagines that the quipu does one thing. And there are books, texts, discussions, debates, trying to explain what they do, all contradictory, showing the same object or similar objects and not finding an answer. So there is repetition, interpretation, invention, and change.
But I think there's also an interesting fact here, like the Codex Mendoza, there's, from the beginning, they're saying, we don't understand what this means. But in the other hand, then you have all these images that you have shown in which there is a very clear interpretation of what they're seeing, quote unquote, in the Americas, because let's say that many of these illustrations were done by people that had never been to the Americas, but they're very clear, almost stating this is what it is there. But with the Codex Mendoza, it's like, we don't know what this means, you know, and that, I was interested in that, in why is that? Like, they're very clear on how we represent the Americas and the people of the Americas, but we don't understand this object that comes from the Americas.
That's not always true. And there's two cases to this. One is that codices are used in America, in Mexico only, as documents of witnessing and proving genealogies, transfers of monies. They're entered into the Huejotzingo, 1529. These are seen as truthful, readable, understandable documents. And Felipe de Guevara, in Comentarios de las Pinturas, which he wrote in 1560, and he and his father are the ones that bring all kinds of paintings to the royal court, has a chapter on Egyptian hieroglyphs in which the modern edition separates this out, but the edition that was printed only in the 18th century shows that they were written together, has a whole explanation of a codex, and which Guevara first says, I don't know if this is independent invention or whether this is something that comes from Egypt. However, we see similarities in the way that hieroglyphs are being constructed. And I was shown X codex, and we don't know what it is. And then he goes ahead and interprets the figures and tells you what they are and why they did what they did. So it's not that certain people didn't look and try to understand and use both Spanish and elite indigenous peoples. And we have all these trials where pre-Columbian codices are brought into the court and presented. And the same thing happens in Peru, but with a different media. And that's textiles. We know that these textiles were brought in. They are shown for reasons that I can't go into, that they have fingernails that are kept of their ancestors, that are embedded into them. This proves that we own the land. So there's all kinds of different media that are accepted interculturally as means of communications. The Codex Mendoza is one that is generated not by the indigenous people, as far as we understand, but it's probably because the beginning of it, at least to say why it's being produced, is not for anything like that. It's being produced as a compendium of a kind of history that is not the way that history is told in other codices. It's really well, anyway, you know this better than I do. But, it's a very composite, made up of perhaps 3 different genres that are sutured together. It's not something you would ever produce in court, to have it adjudicated truthfully with interpreters. I think that there's a reason standing behind it. You must explain this in the book.
But and I want to go to the idea of truthfulness and how, and I think I'm one of those people that do this constantly, that I always think that something that has indigenous hands on it is more truthful than anything that doesn't, right? What do you think about that?
Well, in the case of the Codex Huejotzingo, which is presented by the lawyers of Cortés in a court, the opposing lawyer, that is the person defending the Cabildo and who had robbed Cortés, says all Indians are liars. You can't trust this. However, the judge and everybody else sees images that they can recognize and say, yeah, that's what it is, so that they accept the truthfulness. And Cortés actually wins the case, in part by the witnessing, but more than that, the manuscript. And this is also the case for Don Juan Austria of Tilantongo, who produces the manuscript that shows, and that's the pre-Columbian manuscript, and he shows, those are my ancestors, and they can see that the genealogy that was already depicted in this manuscript. So truthfulness, and this goes back to Austin Tim as well, is about that kind of context in which truth is being made.
Yeah, I mean, the word truth is, very interesting and very complicated, and of course is a constant word that is used in this period, right? The true history, the true account. And so the word true gains importance in the 16th century as it's always presented as a counterpart to that other guy's false history. Mine is the true history, but then you compare all the true histories and, from a postmodern moment, you see that the 16th century is very postmodern because there are many truths as there are narrators. And so I think that, we're talking about 400 years, an entire continent, 2 continents, many genres, many moments. What happens in a court in Mexico City in 1530 is so different from what happens in a court in Mexico City decades later, or in a court elsewhere, or in Europe. So I guess I'm too much of a historian to believe that the word truth is the key here rather than the word context, which was the other word for the symposium.
Okay,
I'll ask you directly a question.
I do have a deep attachment to the word truth, and I am not entirely willing to sacrifice it. I think that it is an important word that has come under increasing criticism for a few decades. And I think that we are, in a way, in many places now suffering the consequences of that devaluation of the meaning of truth. And I think that many of the things that we said today and that we showed today, in a way, tend to show that perhaps abandoning the pursuit for truth is dangerous, and that it's always at least in what we do, an objective that we can never realize, but that we should not abandon. And I think that in many of the discussions that we refer to today, the difficulty in the construction of truth and the importance attached to the direct witnessing into that construction was fundamental and was central to the debates that were taking place back then. You mentioned Clavijero, and one of Clavijero's arguments was that the people that were writing for Europe could never access the truth of the Americas because they had never been there. And he had been, and he knew what he was talking about, and he was speaking the truth. Yeah. So even if the issue of truth for us is not necessarily determinant to understand what truth meant for them, truth was important for them as I think it still is for us. That's what I wanted to say.
I agree with you. And I don't want to get into postmodernist or modernist or whatever debate about truth, because it is at risk now more than ever. But I do want to say that it is important to, and this is context, of understanding what truth might mean. And to give a case in point, because I talked about both Cortez's letter and Bernal Díaz del Castillo's letter. There are two radically different truths told about the same event, and that comes from the subject position of the person writing them. One is the commandant, who glorifies himself, and therefore the events are told from a certain position, just like the maps. You know, you take this kind of subject position and write from it. And Bernal Díaz del Castillo says, wait a minute, I was a foot soldier, and I'm going to tell you from my perspective, not on a horse, but on foot, what it was like. And so you get a radically different kind of narrative about the conquest of Mexico. And that's internal to the people that participated in the conquest. But I think it's important not just to have a binary of conquered and conquerors, but to understand that there are radically different positions about telling the truth to what they think is the truth, and understanding the position from which they're talking. So, you know, one of the work I did here at the Getty was with a manuscript by Martín de Marrúa, which, doing the forensics on that manuscript, actually demonstrated that the great Andean author who I showed here, Juan Poma de Ayala, is basing most of what he says to the king on what Martín de Marrúa had written, and he copies it. But he is writing, they're writing from entirely, one's a Mercedarian and one is an Andean author who has been dispossessed of his own land. And as you see the two chronicles diverge, they're not trying to dissimulate, but they have a different points of view by the author, and without actually, well, they do know it. But anyway, the point is that I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is what you're saying is, you know, this issue of truth is one that no one now is talking about. Where are you coming from with that truth? Just as where were they coming from with that truth? And then what does truth mean at that point to claim it true? And it can be a court of law, or it can be across two chronicles. And so you have different historical moments that we're witnessing. My talk was slightly different in the sense that this is assumed to be a genre of truth, that is, a mapping, you know. You can laugh now, but not then. This is the movement of across a kind of representation of autopic presentation of, but it does something about what you think the truth is about position. So, anyway, I'll stop there because I'm getting lost.
Yeah, but maps are also a great way of showing appropriation, right? And that was the whole point of this, with this mapping, right? Also to show what it belongs to whom, and what it was, and who belongs to. But I want to go back to some of the voices of the people that were going kind of like against the regular discourse that was happening at the period. So, for example, you talked about Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, of course, Montaigne, Diderot, and then Clavilejo. I mean, so what do they really change the regular discourse with these different ideas and voices during their period? How are they perceived?
Did they make a difference? Did they make a difference? Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm. In the perception.
Well, you showed the Descripción de Tlaxcala, which was presented to Philip II by the embassy from Tlaxcala, in which they were there to argue certain rights and privileges, which actually were given to them. And the Tlaxcalans then were given lands to the north. They were given lands to, so it's a case-by-case kind of situation, which is dependent upon historical conditions. The Tlaxcalans, of course, were the allies of Cortés. So, but even though they were and have been given certain privileges, those have been rescinded or at least trampled on, and they go to the court in Spain, to Philip II, and argue before him, but also present him. Yeah, yeah.
But for example, Montaigne, like how is his essay received when he's talking about we're also as horrible as?
I would say that Montaigne's essay did not make a huge difference in how cannibals were perceived, or in the...
But is it criticized? Like, not accepted during his time?
Well, Montaigne's essays were published after his death, so the reception is later, I would say. The reception of other authors that I mentioned that were publishing during their lifetime was more polemical. That was the case with Las Casas very early. And from the very beginning, there were people in Spain reacting to and denouncing his account. And there were people in countries that were in conflict with Spain celebrating his account and using it politically. And exactly the same thing could be said about Raynal. The second Raynal publishes his compiled work out of the hand of many authors, the first thing the Parliament of Paris does is to outlaw it and to make it illegal because it is detrimental not only to the interests and the image of France and of the Europeans, but also to the church. And what happens immediately after that is that within 20 years, there are 35 pirate editions of his work, which shows that people were actually very interested in reading what he had to say. So your question was, did they make a difference? My reply would be, not really in the treatment that the people that they were trying to defend received, but perhaps very much so in some of the people that were interested in reading them and that were using their works with a polemical intention.
We're going to open now for questions from the public. Yeah. And if you please can try to make your questions short so we don't lose a lot of time with the questions, that would be great.
In your interventions, we observed from sketches to engravings to printings. So how formally the reproduction process changed the truth in terms of immediacy of the participant observation of the artist? Thanks.
A small question.
Short and small.
Short and small.
Go ahead. No, but well, I mean, that's a wonderful question in the sense that, so you were showing Debris' magnificent classicizing images of horror. But, you know, many of those originally occur in a very woodcut representations in Italy by, now I can't think of his name.
Ramusio? No.
No. Ken? Who? I can't think. He isn't published in Spanish until the 20th century because he's so anti-Spanish. He's Italian. I can't think of his name all of a sudden. Anyway, what you can see is that transmission from drawings. Who'd you say, Ramusio? Yeah. Oh, I thought you said, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it is Ramusio. You can see, I'm sorry, that he was doing drawings and he combines them, and they're very rough until you get a classicizing view of the same horrors, and it really changes, and these are not woodcut, as Ramusio's are, but they're copper engravings, yeah. And it really universalizes, in a way, these images that takes them out of a really much rougher sense. And you can see all kinds of references to European Renaissance paintings, et cetera, that are not in those. And so it really shifts the rhetorical part of the image. And it's also the clean line of the copper engraving versus the rough line. I mean, you do get, and you can trace that, and it's really kind of interesting. I don't think anybody has, but it's really kind of interesting to see that. I mean, that must be, I mean, that's when I was looking at the various, how it changes, of the Mendoza.
Yeah, I mean, you pose your question in terms of immediacy, right? And I think that there is such a interest in this period in perhaps other genres about what you can know through an image, about an experience, right? In anatomy, it is central and the idea that what you want is not something that shows you things as they are, because that would not give you the kind of information that you need, but that edits and summarizes and highlights what you want to see, not what things look like, but what you want to see from the image. And that discourse is happening around the same times and around the same print cities where many of these are getting printed. But it's not, the discourse about the work that the images are doing is not explicit for these publications as it is for other genres. But I think that these images are operating within the same image mode of print in this period that is like the image selects, the image compresses, the image magnifies some things and erases others, is never the idea of the image as indexical or naked, right? nuda. And so I think that is in these images too, but it doesn't get discussed the same way.
Hello. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. So it's a great way to start off the morning. Tom, I have a question for you. The Cortez's map, or the Tenochtitlan map, I always love the little map of the Gulf Coast next to it. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that subject position, because there Yucatan is at the top, and the Rio Pánuco leads into the country. And so it is one of those topsy-turvy images that you were talking about with the South at the upper part. And if you could maybe talk about that. Of course, I also can't help but relate it to the Florentine Codex, because that's where my mind is these days. And thinking about the orientation of the Gulf Coast in the frontispiece of Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, where it's also basically shown the way that it's shown in the Cortez map.
Well, yeah. First of all, yes, it's shown like Cortez. I mean, that becomes fixed. I mean, it's very hard to shift that position. But to go back to your first part of the question, which is the Caribbean and the islands and the Yucatan, that image is never discussed. It's cut out almost always of the representation of Tenochtitlan, because what's important is Tenochtitlan, and so as far as I know, hardly anybody talks about that image. But that's a fold-out, it's a double page. It's intended. There are two different representations that are pulled together, and why the Yucatan is placed as it is seems, I think, to be either seeing it in verse, should I say, that then has to be reoriented to fit that relationship to Tenochtitlan, which is crazy. But I can't quite, you understand what I mean? That you need the coast to be east of Tenochtitlan to understand that this is where we came. We came from Cuba, we came to the coast, and we got to Tenochtitlan. And this is, the prize. So that's the big, and so it's there to situate you in relationship to what the whole narrative is going to unfold. It's completely out of scale to the major representation of Tenochtitlan, so you can see it's out of scale, but indexical to how this happened. And he doesn't talk about it. There's no text that goes with this. There is text, but it doesn't talk about what these maps are doing, except that it says that the Latin does talk about the map of Tenochtitlan. It doesn't talk about really the Caribbean.
So do you think it's reading order, so that when you
Yep.
I have another question.
Hello, thank you for the panel. Hopefully you'll excuse this question, but the conversation about pursuit for postmodern truth kind of inspired me to ask this. One of the things that I'm sensing and thinking about how indigeneity in a very contemporary way is being framed seems to be like this conversation around a kind of post-humanism. And in fact, how we're thinking about ourselves in relationship to nature and our relationship to the planet. And often it's framed through a kind of like revindication or reclaiming of indigenous worldviews and cosmologies. I was just in Mexico City, and the concept of, it was post-Cartesian was the term I saw over and over again. And so I'm just wondering, as a panel, if you've thought or you have any reflections on how this reframing of indigenous knowledge, thought, science, whatever you want to call it, is Is this some way another reinvention that's going along long paths of reinventions, or if you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yes. By all means.
No, it's a great question. It's another small question.
Well, if you go to the exhibition, the final part of the show with the Nilsson Baniwa's last installation piece is called The Nilsson's Reinvention. So, yes, I also agree that, you know, we can think about it that way. It's the many reinventions.
But
that's one of them.
I would like to add one thing, if I can. I think that the question is very interesting and it's very pressing at this time. I think that you can very well think of that as another reinvention, but it's not completely detached from what we've been saying today, in the way that even from the beginning, there was an attempt in the Americas to represent not only the continent, but also the people that lived in it, as people that lived closer to nature. And that's edgy, I would say. There is a thin line if you go through that argument, because it could also be used or interpreted in the sense that these people, as being closer to nature, lack something that at one point would have been called culture, at other point it would have been called artificiality, at another point it would have been called industriousness, and I think that's risky, because it's depriving the people you are talking about of something that they actually do all the time. And it's an argument that could also be made not only about America, but about representations and interventions regarding other places like Africa. And I will stop there, but we can further discuss it if you want. But this Edenic view of the peoples of other places that are closer to something that we either celebrate or reject, like nature, is dangerous and edgy, I would say, as a political discourse about the people you are talking about.
I also want to add something. I mean, you know, it is one of the key questions that are in our worlds of study these days, and, you know, all of this, whether being close to nature means a lack or a gain, a loss or an enrichment. And, you know, the idea of the human and the more than human, and how it plays into this. As you were saying, this idea of whether being close to nature, what that is doing for the telling of the story. But I think that for me, part of what is interesting is what is being ascribed to whom and to what effect when. And so in this period, we see this constant insistence that these are people without government, people without currency, people without monogamy, people without civility, people without so many things, right? But also people without history, that they are always in the past. And for me, the importance of, whether you call it civility, culture, but also of history for any people is so, there's an ethics there that I find very, very, very important. And so one of the things that really intrigues me about this period, and that is a constant preoccupation in my work, is a relationship between the sort of the X and Y axis of geography and temporality, right? Where places are positioned according to imagined centers and peripheries, how that maps to a present and a past that is continuous and doesn't have history. And so for me, one of the important questions with this interest in other traditions, other forms of knowledge, other ontologies, is what is being put there and what is being taken. And the problem of history is one that really worries me. The idea that any human group is always in the present and changing, ahistorical, is one that feels to me profoundly unethical. And so that is my concern with this.
I would just say that it's a really critical question today, and it's a political question that has ramifications way outside of academia. And what I mean by that, I'll give you two examples, and it really has to do with Spain's relationship to Latin America. And so recently, a year ago, the mayor of Madrid came to New York to talk about Madrid with the stock market and everybody, but she came to the New York Hispanic Society, and this was during the change from Columbus Day to Indigenous Day. And she declared that, among other things, that indigenism is the new communism. Now, what that means, as somebody who follows, she does, Franco, that means extinction. That means violence. That means oppositional to indigenous rights. The King of Spain then goes to Puerto Rico and says, I don't know what this is all about. All we did was bring culture, education, and civilization. Meaning there was no civilization, there was no other alternative way of seeing the world and being in the world. So whether we are Cartesian, post-Cartesian, or pre-Cartesian, is not, for me, in question. What is going to happen when we start having contemporary discourse that is asking for, at least rhetorically, what Nicholas has shown happened. And there's the denial of that, the denial of a kind of history that is based upon the extirpation of the beliefs that we're talking about. That this was not an innocent kind of confrontation between animism and Catholicism. I have a wonderful cartoon in which you see a Catholic priest saying, your religion is false, and the Inca says, well, at least the sun is real. So I think that, it really is subject position of, yeah, I can accept my religion because it's real. I can accept my science because only that science is real. I'm not asking for an entire, repudiation of Western civilization, but I think we do need to at least have some kind of respect for other forms of knowledge and being.
Well, we need to stop here because there's no more time for questions. We'll be back after lunch, but please remember that Mary Miller offered a tour of the Codex, so the Maya Codex, at, what was it, 1:45? 1:45, so please go and check the Codex, and we'll be back at 2. Thank you. Yes. 2:30, sorry, 2:30.